It's a beautiful spring day here in Tennessee. It gets me thinking about cleaning up some and preparing for another great year in the landscape. And so one of the most important things that we want to think about this time of year is not just cleaning up some of the perennials, getting rid of some of the winter annuals and weeds that we see, but what are the proper pruning practices? So we're going to talk just a little bit this morning about proper practices for pruning different types of hydrangeas. I actually have three of the main types of hydrangeas in front of me right here, and another just a little ways up in the flower bed where it gets a little bit more sunlight. And so we're going to kind of jump in and look at those nuances of those different types of hydrangeas. Right here in front of me we have a whole row of Oakleaf Hydrangea. Now these are native to our area. They require certainly some afternoon shade. They can be a beautiful addition to a woodland garden, and they bloom on last year's wood. So one of the main suggestions that we would often give about Oakleaf Hydrangea is don't prune them too much. They tend to have a more informal, sometimes a little bit less neat or regular growth pattern, but they can be a beautiful addition to a garden. This is actually a ruby slipper. There are some newer cultivars that tend to have a little bit more compact growth habit. You can see its structure here. I'm not really going to do any pruning on this plant. This is actually a snowflake in front of me, and I'm just going to do a little bit of pruning on this plant because it's growing a little bit taller and I want a little bit more branching on the top of this plant, and so I'm going to do a little bit of maintenance pruning there, but this is simply for shape. We're going to be very, very careful about the cuts that we make on our Oakleaf Hydrangea, because when we do it in the spring like this, we're actually removing some buds that have been set last fall. So right here in front of me we have two of the most common types of hydrangeas that we would have in a lot of our residential landscape beds. And actually right here, this is a Hydrangea Macrophylla, or a big leaf hydrangea, actually represents one of the most common pruning mistakes that we often see, and that is coming in the spring and pruning off buds that were set last year. So for these types of hydrangeas, they will typically set bud on old wood. Now if you have a reblooming type of hydrangea, it will set buds on both old wood and new wood, but the same general pruning practices will generally apply. What we want to do in the spring is not much. I'm going to wait just a little bit longer, and if in another few weeks I can see that there might be some of these tips that truly are dead, I can come in and prune those out. But it's very important to give it enough time that we make sure that we don't prune off anything that's live, that's going to break bud, and that's going to bloom. Now sometimes, depending upon our weather and our winter, there will be some issues with potentially winter kill on some of these buds. So we're not guaranteed that everything that's set here will bloom, but it's definitely not going to bloom if we prune it off. Now right here behind me we actually have the exact opposite, and so this is a smooth hydrangea, or Hydrangea arborescens, and this blooms on new wood. So it's a much simpler pruning practice. Typically what we do for these types of plants is come in and prune them all short in this time in the early part of the spring, and so about a foot. We'll make several cuts here, and when this new stem grows, then that's going to be what sets the new buds. So we can make sure that these are neat and tidy, remove all of the old blooms, and they'll be prepared for a beautiful, generally June bloom in our part of the world. So this is the fourth type of hydrangea that we often see in our landscape beds, and actually in some ways it may even be the most common, because this is Hydrangea Paniculata. It can handle higher light levels. You can see that we have a lot of shade for this lower area of the planting bed that I showed you, and we have almost until 3 o'clock in the afternoon sunlight in this part of the garden. And so Hydrangea Paniculata, like arborescens, blooms on new wood, and so we don't have to worry about cutting off any flower buds when we do our early spring pruning. But we also don't need to do an extensive amount of pruning on these hydrangeas, and so for the most part we don't need to prune our paniculatas too heavy, but we'll come in, we'll remove last year's blooms, and we'll get it all cleaned up and ready to go. So with this brief overview on pruning your hydrangeas, we hope that you are ready to go this spring, get you all prepared for a beautiful summer and fall of hydrangea blooms. Thanks for joining us.